In this video, I'm going to be switching out the rear passenger CV axle on a 2008 Honda CRV. If you haven't already, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Check out my channel content for more, and hey, have fun when it comes to cars. What has led me to actually replace this CV axle? Well, it's a continuation of the original trailing arm replacement. The CV axle actually got twisted and the boot got torn, and when contamination gets into the special grease that lubricates both the Archepa joint and tripod joint for the inner, well, they need to be replaced or overhauled. Now, I didn't choose to overhaul them because it's easier just for me to replace them. The real issues that I really faced was the axle nut. 1-inch ratchet and breaker bar. Had to break that axle nut free. That thing was rusty. Okay. Other than that, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward process, a little more involved than most CV axles, so just keep that in mind, but no more than a normal car. So, without further ado, let's get right to it.
I'm going to start by using a 19mm and removing the wheel and tire. Using a 33mm, which is obviously the wrong size for this rear axle, I'm going to remove this axle nut, making sure that the joint is actually free. I'm going to take a rubber mallet first so I don't mushroom the tip and tap it. It looks like it's free. At this time, when you replace these, it's probably a good time to replace the whole wheel bearing while I'm at it. Using a Phillips and removing these rotor screws. It looks like there's one already loose, which is a good thing. I do not want to reuse these. I might as well just purchase another one. Let's check this. Oh, this one's already free too. Winner, winner, chicken dinner. That's super awesome. Using a 17mm, I'm going to remove the upper and lower brake caliper bolts. I'm going to lift up or pry out on this. I'm going to pull out. See if I can compress that a little bit. It doesn't look like it, so it looks like we're gonna have to service this brake caliper as well eventually. But first, we're just gonna pry it off and slide it on back. You can break the rotor free, bring out the hearing protection, and the air hammer. Let's see if it'll come off now. Yes! Yes, man. Rotor's off. Using a 17mm, I gotta remove this cam. Take a rubber mallet, tap it out. With this 17mm, I'm just gonna loosen and remove that using my gun. And we can pry this unit away. I'm going to tap the axle shaft out. Save both time and effort. I'm just going to zip through and bust it free. And I can pop the axle up and out. The axle is free. You can see, just like this. Looks like we need a wheel bearing. See that this axle has a blown seal. We're just gonna pry right here, and there we go, and it's out. All I have to do is just jostle it out. Okay, pass it through, and it came apart. There we go. Here's our 2-shaft axle shaft. There's our vibration though. Our axle shaft number. Making sure that they look identical. They look identical. I'm gonna slide this axle shaft right back into place. The new one. Removing the axle nut. Getting all that dirt on me. Okay, we're inside the hole. Making sure. Go straight inside. Okay. Take a little bit of the anti-seize. Stick it on the splines as well as the face, just to keep it from corroding again. Stick the splines back into the hub. I'm going to pull this back and lift up, and then try and jostle this thing back in. Sorry, this is such an awkward angle for me. Oh, go on. Third. There we go. Okay, we're in it. Now we just got to align the splines. I already put the cam back in, as well as the other bolt. I can stick the axle nut on, 36 millimeter, and we can torque it down when we're done. So this is pulling it in. Axle shaft is in. Now we can reassemble the rest of this. Looks like we're gonna need new brake shoes eventually. I'm just gonna spray some brake parts cleaner on the shoes where I touched. Getting the rotor back on, making sure to line up the rotor screws, just like that. Nope. You want to make sure those rotor screws line up. This goes in one direction. Backing plate is kind of scraping on there. Take one of our not mauled rotor screws and just stick it on there. I'm just going to stick one in. Reinstall these two shims that go right here. Honda, for some reason, use shims. Most of the time they're missing. Tap that back on. And I drop the shim. Get this one in there. Okay, top one is on. Reinstall the bottom screw. I'm going to torque that to 62 foot-pounds. Do the same for the cam, but when the car gets aligned. So I'm going to tighten that up preliminarily and just hand tighten it down. And it's just going to make it snug for now. I'm going to torque these bolts to 79 foot-pounds. We can reinstall the wheel and tire and tighten this axle nut.
Yeah, I'm lifting this pretty high.
Take the air gun with the 19. Now we can bring it down and tighten down that axle nut. Now that the car is on the ground, using that 36, I'm going to torque that axle nut to 181 foot-pounds. There we go. What I'm going to do is peen this over, this axle nut, using a punch. Peened. Put the wheel back on, torque the wheel down, and this is done. 86 foot-pounds. Stick the cap back on. Done.
How is that? It's not difficult. It just takes a little bit of time to get everything apart. And I mean, it was a really straightforward process. Now the car will have to be aligned if you didn't mark the cam bolt for the rear trailing arm, because it needs to be aligned. Also, if you needed to replace the wheel bearing, that would be a perfect time to do it, because that wheel bearing, if the seal goes bad, it'll start rusting away from the inside out. Otherwise, it was a pretty straightforward process. I really don't have any complaints. The car is really rusty, and I mean, it is Michigan at its finest. So, if you haven't already, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Check out my channel content for more, and hey, have fun when it comes to cars. I think I mentioned that before. Hey,